You've heard a lot about the grassroots efforts and the bottom-up practices and endeavors to improve what we do. Now I'd like to introduce to you our keynote speaker who will talk a little bit more and has had quite an influence on the top-down processes that help us do our jobs. I'm really delighted to welcome back Dr. Ethan Nadelmann. Dr. Nadelmann is the founder and executive director of the Drug Policy Alliance, the leading organization in the United States promoting alternatives to the war on drugs. As a longtime proponent of drug policy reform, both domestically and internationally, he's played a role in discussions and policy initiatives concerned with pharmaceutical legislation and drug sentencing, the prevention of overdose fatalities, and marijuana policy. The importance and relevance of these concerns to those of us in pain management can hardly be overstated. And so, without further ado, please welcome our keynote speaker, Ethan Nadelmann. Welcome.
Thanks, Michael.
Yeah, here's your point.
Okay, thank you very much. It's good to be back at PAINWeek. So, I'm going to start off talking about an issue which does not directly engage, I would imagine, most of you, which is the war on drugs and the efforts to change the way we deal with illegal drugs in our society. But I'm fully aware that the issues I'm talking about lie a bare half step from many of the issues that you worry about and are concerned about, and that to some extent, when we think about the future of pain management, the future of drug control policy, the future of what it means to live in a civilized society, these issues turn out to be very, 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 very much part of a holistic whole. So let me start off this way by just saying, I think the war on drugs is an extraordinary disaster in our country and around the world. That's what I think. And when I say that war on drugs, I mean that presumption, that assumption that certain drugs need to be treated first and foremost as criminal problems. That anybody who grows them, uses, possesses them, sells them, does anything with them, right, almost even thinks about them, has got to be defined as a criminal. That in dealing with those drugs and not those drugs, we are going to put police and prosecutors and judges and military and prisons front and center in dealing with those ones over there. Whereas these ones, the legal ones, the pharmaceutical ones, are going to be in a somewhat different category, right? Now, if you think about that notion, you know, why do we do that? Why do we do that? And why, especially in the United States, have we done that with such a ferocity for so many years? And I think part of it, just goes back to who we have been as a society. You know, the simple fact that we prohibited alcohol. Not many Western societies thought, you know, oh my God, there's a real drug problem right there, alcohol, real problem, husbands beating their wives, traffic accidents in the roads, problems in the factories, and let's prohibit it. And maybe we'll eradicate alcohol by prohibiting alcohol. Of course, you know what happened, right? It actually worked okay for a few years, but after 12, 13 years of alcohol prohibition, what happened? Al Capone, organized crime, violence, crime, corruption, overflowing courthouses and jail cells, bootleggers shooting it up, young people looking at the bootleggers as role models, hundreds of thousands of people being blinded, poisoned, and killed by bad bootleg liquor that was more dangerous because it was illegally produced, cynicism growing for the law, millions of Americans getting their medical and religious prescriptions for alcohol as a way to get around those prohibitions, and ultimately a sense of cynicism. And of course, come the Depression, people said, what? We gave up one of the biggest sources of federal tax revenue to make a prohibition, and instead of taking in billions of dollars, we were going to spend billions of dollars paying ever greater numbers of cops and prosecutors to lock up zillions of Americans? No, I don't think so. And we repealed alcohol prohibition. Now, what's going on today in this country and so many others? Isn't it like alcohol prohibition times 50? Look at Mexico over the last 6, 7 years, what, 100,000 people dead in those drug wars down there? Bystanders, drug dealers, innocents, cops, corrupt cops, honest cops, you name it. Look what's going on in the Caribbean and parts of Latin America, sometimes with the gangsters taking over barrios and favelas, sometimes whole cities or regions, and a few cases even countries. Afghanistan, what's the #1 source of the GDP of Afghanistan? Opium, opiates, and heroin. West Africa, all of a sudden Kofi Annan, the former head of the United Nations, has created a West African Drug Policy Commission because he sees narco-corruption beginning to turn some West African countries into narco-states. And then we look here on our own country. In 1980, there were 50,000 people locked up for a drug charge in America. Today, there's 500,000 people behind bars for violating a drug law against production, possession, use, sale, what have you. The vast majority of those 500,000 are not kingpins. Many of them are merely selling to support their habits, and many of them weren't selling to anybody whatsoever, simply getting caught in possession. That tenfold increase in incarceration in the United States, and by the way, just to put it in some perspective, we lock up more people in America for a drug law violation than all of Western Europe locks up for everything. And they have 100 million more people than we do, right? And the rates of drug use aren't that different than ours. And the rates of nonviolent crime aren't that different than ours. We have more of a gun thing going on, a little more violent crime. But just to put this in perspective, right? And then put this in the bigger perspective, we've gone from 500,000 people behind bars in 1980 for everything to 2.3 million people today. We lead the world when it comes to per capita rates of incarceration. We are #1. The land of the free, the land of the brave, leads the world when it comes to incarcerating our fellow citizens. The Russians are in second place, huffing and puffing, trying to keep up. We've left them in the dust, right? Our rates of incarceration roughly 5-6 times those in other civilized societies. Right? No democratic society has incarcerated people the way we incarcerate people in history. And when you look especially at who's going to prison, it's so often people of color, young, especially men with black and brown skin, who are incarcerated in our country at a rate that makes incarceration in apartheid South Africa look like a walk in the park by comparison. That vastly exceeds the rates of incarceration of the Soviet gulags of the 30s, 40s, and 50s. That's not right. That's not right, locking up people like that. 1.5 million drug arrests a year, half of them for marijuana, no less. Half of them for marijuana. And then what else happens with the drug war? When HIV came around in the early 1980s, being spread not just by homosexual and sometimes heterosexual sex, but by people sharing syringes when they were injecting drugs. And other countries, the Netherlands, Australia, even Margaret Thatcher's United Kingdom, said, oh my God, well, I know we want to stop addiction. We want to make people be drug-free. But first and foremost, we have to stop the spread of this deadly disease, HIV, for which we have no cure. And if that means allowing drug addicts, drug injectors to get clean needles, then so be it. That's what we're going to do. We're going to save their lives, keep them alive, so then one day we'll deal with their addiction. But did we do that in the United States? No, not in most places. We prefer to let almost 250,000 people die, not just the junkies, the drug injectors, but their lovers, their spouses, and their babies. Because we had this notion, can't give a junkie a clean needle. What, are you going to give them the instrument of their own destruction? You know, they need to bottom out, 12-step, get drug-free. Can't help somebody until they're willing to deal with their drug addiction problem. Well, that moralistic anti-scientific view was deadly in this country and so many others. And there was no justification for it. The Dutch just did it on common sense. They saw, they had junkies. I use the word junkies loosely. I shouldn't use that term, but injecting drug users. And they just could see, here's how it's spreading. Common sense says, give the injecting drug user a clean needle, let them, and get them to throw away the dirty needle. That's what's going to save lives, right? Just made sense. In the United States, we said, prove it to us. Well, the first piece of evidence was when it emerged that illegal drug users who were diabetic had lower rates of HIV than illegal drug users who were not diabetic. Why do you think? Well, you know, one group was getting clean needles from the pharmacy, right? Finally, Congress says, well, okay, get the National Academy of Science Institute of Medicine to do a report, let's do it. And they come out with a report saying, look at that, making clean needles available to illicit drug users through needle exchange programs or pharmacies decreases the spread of HIV without increasing drug use. That was the evidence. They gave it to Congress, and Congress said, we were just kidding about that evidence. If your evidence was going to come out the wrong way, we didn't really want to see it. And even today, the Congress bans a single penny of federal money from being spent on a clean needle. Better to let them die. What else has happened with all of this war on drugs? Right? And as they say, you go around the world, the crime, the violence, the corruption, you look at, I mean, the violence is not as bad in the United States anymore, but that's still a major problem. You look at the shootouts in every city in America, from Las Vegas to New York to New Orleans to small towns, and that's what's happening is again. As I said, alcohol prohibition times 50. Right? Now, if you think about it, when you go back 15, 20 years ago, what were people saying? Remember, that was the days of Ronald Reagan, Nancy Reagan, just say no. George Bush. This Friday, I think, is going to be the 25th anniversary of George Bush giving that speech where he held up a bag of cocaine and declared war on America, war on drugs. Right? Right? A drug-free world, we can do it, is what the UN proclaimed in 1998. Drug-free society on the motto of the National Institute on Drug Abuse, an otherwise supposedly scientific agency supporting scientific research. Well, of course, what do we really know? That there has never been a drug-free society in human history, except maybe the Eskimos because they couldn't grow anything, but I mean, by and large, there's never been a drug-free. It is remarkable the extent to which you go and look around the world in ancient primitive societies, how people who had no contact with any other societies somehow figured out that that piece of fruit, if it fell over there and you did that to that and you keep it around, whoa, and drink it, that would be fun, right? Pick that mushroom and that fungus, oops, that one kills you. That one makes you see God, you know? I mean, it's amazing. All over the world, chewing the coca leaf. Opium goes back. You know, they dig up prehistoric man, and where they finding little pockets of opium and cannabis in their little hunting packs. I mean, somehow we know. Now, one can also say that, what is this? Andrew Weil, in his book, The Natural Mind, you know, Andrew Weil, the guru of integrative medicine, in his first book, when he used to write about drugs, in the book, The Natural Mind, he speculated that maybe all human beings, we all need to alter our state of consciousness. That altering our state of consciousness is almost as innate to being a human being as our desire for sex or companionship, even food, right? He talked about how, you know, what little kids do, right? They spin themselves in circles, right? Why? So it makes them feel dizzy and nice. And we know that we can alter our consciousness. We can even alter our experience of pain through things like meditation and prayer and exercise. But what's remarkable is the virtual universality with which human societies all around the world and throughout history have discovered, devised, uncovered plants, chemicals, and substances with which to alter our consciousness, to expedite that alteration of consciousness, sometimes for better and sometimes for worse. We as human beings inhabit this plant with those plants and those chemicals being produced in illegal labs and legal pharmaceutical laboratories and what have you. And the future is one in which these substances are only going to be more and more available in every ever diverse formulations and types. The challenge is not how do we get rid of these drugs, because it can't be done. The challenge is not how do we build a moat between those drugs and our societies, between those drugs and our children, because that can be not done. The challenge is, how do we learn how to live with this reality? How do we learn how to live with drugs so that they cause the least possible harm and in many cases the greatest possible good? That's the holistic challenge of human beings and drugs on this planet. That's the challenge. Now, you know, I wondered when I was beginning my research years ago how and why it was that certain drugs were legal and others were illegal. Certain drug users were legal and other drug users were illegal. You know, why was it? Alcohol was legal except for our brief experience with alcohol prohibition. Tobacco legal except for some brief period in some states in the late 19th century. Pharmaceuticals over here. But marijuana, cocaine, heroin, psychedelics, in fact, all these other things fully illegal. How did that happen? There must have been some group of wise men. You know, an early institute of medicine that convened in Washington in the late 1890s, right? And assessed the relative risks of all these substances and benefits and then rank order them. That must have been, right? No, never happened, never happened. In fact, if you ask the question, why are some drugs here legal and other drugs here illegal? What you realize is that it has almost nothing to do with the relative risks and harms of the respective substances, and almost everything to do with who uses and who is perceived to use particular substances. So flashback in history, 1870s, who were the principal consumers of opiates in America? You know the answer? Middle-aged white women. Middle-aged white women, right? There was no Motrin, there was no aspirin, there was no sanitation really. You know, opiates was the analgesic for all ills, for menopause and aches and pains and depression, you name it, right? There was terrible sanitation, people had diarrhea all the time, nothing stops you up like opiates do, right? That laudanum, you know, laudanum by mail order, down at the pharmacy, at the corner store, millions and millions of middle-aged women taking this stuff, not just women, but especially women, right? Easily available, some of them drinking a little too much of it, but by and large, and not just in our society, but many others, you know? And do you think anybody ever thought of criminalizing it? No, because nobody thought about putting their white grandma or auntie behind bars, right? But when all of a sudden, in the early, late 1870s, 1880s, all of a sudden the Chinese started to come over by the hundreds of thousands, working on the mines and the railroads and all of these other places, you know, working 80, 90 hours a week, really hard work, back-breaking labor, and going back home at the end of the night to their dormitory, whatever it might be, and smoking up a little opium just like they did in the old country, just like they've been doing for generations, just like the white people were doing with their booze in the end of the day. That's when white people started to freak out. What was that Chinaman going to do to our precious white women, addicting them to opium and turning them into sex slaves? The first opium prohibition laws in America were right here in Nevada and in California, 1870s and 80s, directed at the feared Chinese opium users. The first cocaine laws in the United States in the South in the first decade of the last century, right? Black men working on the docks, right? Those Negroes taking that white powder up their black noses, and who knows, they'd forget their proper place in society and go out, and who knows what they do to our precious white women. Hence the first cocaine prohibitions, right? Remember, not so long before that, Coca-Cola had cocaine in it until 1900. And has anybody ever heard of the massive Coca-Cola addiction problem of the 1890s? I don't think so. Maybe because Coca-Cola with a little cocaine in it was no more addictive or dangerous than Coca-Cola is today with that caffeine in it. Maybe it's about the dose. Maybe it's about the potency, right? The first anti-marijuana laws in the Southwest and the western states of the United States directed at the Mexican migrants, Mexican Americans coming up, taking those jobs from the good white people, going back home to their little communities, smoking up a little reefer, a little marijuana cigarette, la cucaracha, right? And once again, the white people freaked out. Freaked out. Even alcohol prohibition was to some extent a broader conflict between the white Americans and the not-so-white Americans, right? The white Americans came over in the late 18th, early 19th century, and from northern and western Europe, and the not-so-white Americans coming from southern Europe and eastern Europe, in the late 19th, early 20th century, flooding into this country the way we see people flooding in from Mexico and Central America, freaking everybody out, and bringing with them their beer and their vino and their Schlivowitz. I guess many people here don't know what Schlivowitz is, but anyway, it's a hearty liquor. Fast forward to how these laws are enforced. The issue of race and ethnicity and xenophobia permeated the origins of these laws, and it permeates the way these laws are enforced until today. You look at most surveys, and black, brown, and white people aren't that different in the rates at which they use various of these drugs. But you look at who's getting arrested and who's getting busted, It tends to be one group more than the other. It tends to be one of the beautiful experiments we've been emerging in the many cities. If you were to randomly stop 100 black kids, 100 brown kids, and 100 white kids in any city in America, roughly the same percent would have a little marijuana in their pocket. But in every city in America, the black kid is 3 to 10 times more likely than the white kid to be arrested and land up with a criminal record. If that's not right and if that's not fair, tell me what is, right? They weren't doing more crime. They weren't doing anything. They were doing the same thing that the white kids were doing, just having a little weed in their pocket, but they're the ones getting busted in the criminal record. Something fundamentally wrong there. Do you think it's possible? Would it be possible that America would lead the world in incarceration rates if most of the people going behind bars were white people? No, of course not. Of course not. It just wouldn't happen that way. There is this other, in our great 300 million person society, there's a way of otherizing these other people that's just not right. And the war on drugs is the thing that is driven. And not just the 500,000 people who are there behind bars for violating a drug law, but then the other people who get involved in the violence and the drug dealing, the people who are prostituting and doing other things to support their habits, which are more expensive because the drugs are illegal. All of these things, ultimately at least a third of our jail and prison system are there because of our failed prohibition policies, right? So now what am I saying here? Am I saying that we should repeal all drug prohibition? That we should do what we did with alcohol and legalize all these drugs and sell them the way? And I'll tell you, I'm not saying that. And I'm ambivalent about that. You know, I'd say 3 days of the week, I think maybe it's the right idea. 3 days of the week, I think it's a bad idea. On Sundays, I'm agnostic. But the way I think it's best to think about this is to think about our options not as either or, drug war or legalize, is to think of our options as arrayed along a spectrum of policy options, right? From the most draconian policies over here, you know, Saudi Arabia, Singapore, you know, cut off their hands, whip them, rip them off the streets, drug test them without cause, throw them into quasi-prison camps, you name it, bing, 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 all the way over here, right, to the free market, no controls on sales except maybe to kids, you know, what I might call Milton Friedman's wet dream, right? Libertarian scenario. And then to think, right, what is it we're trying to do here? Well, one way to think about what we're trying to do is we're trying to come up with a rational drug policy that does two things. The first is to reduce the harms of government policies, whether they're prohibitionist policies or backward regulatory policies. And the second is to reduce the harms of drugs themselves, the disease, the death, the suffering, the crime, all of the negative consequences of the misuse of drugs. And that the optimal drug control policy is going to be one which balances between reducing the harms of government policies and the harms of drugs. The other way to think about it is what we're trying, because I also start off with this assumption. I don't think there's any inherent reason why drugs, anything about drugs, needs to be part of the criminal justice system. I mean, think about it. Rape, murder, theft, it's in the Bible, Code of Hammurabi, everybody's moral code. That should be a crime, right? Bottom line. Possessing, using, putting a particular substance in your body, substance X, Y, or Z, why is that inherently a crime? Right? Why does the government have any interest about whether you put drug B or drug D or drug X, whether it's alcohol or tobacco or heroin or Dilaudid or cocaine or amphetamine or why should that be in any way the government's business? And why should there be any moral judgment associated with which of these substances you happen to be putting in? I mean, what we know is that these moral judgments have changed over the years. There have been societies that treated the drugs that are now illegal as legal, and the ones that treat things like alcohol as illegal. Look at the Muslim world today, right? Tobacco's been prohibited in the past. Coffee's been prohibited in the past. Tea's been prohibited in the past for various political reasons, right? The only people, I think, who have a coherent moral standard on this are the Mormons. You know, thou shalt not ingest any psychoactive substance to alter thy state of consciousness. Right? I mean, that's a coherent notion. No alcohol, tobacco, no coffee, no marijuana, cocaine, or heroin, right? I mean, you know, it seems, you know, consistent. Although I've heard that there's something called Mormon tea. And it turns out it's got ephedra in it. I've also heard that the Mormons have the biggest ice cream bashes in America. That sugar addiction, you know what I'm talking about. I've also heard that Mormon dentists give more, nitrous oxide than any other dentist, but I don't know that for a fact. It may go to the issue of whether or not anybody can exist without altering your consciousness with these substances, right? So I start off with this notion that there's nothing inherently immoral about putting any one substance in our body. That what morality consists of is how we treat our fellow human beings. Are we a good citizen? A good friend, a good parent, a good child? Do we obey basic moral notions in terms of how we treat fellow human beings? But that what we do to ourselves and what we put in here, that's not a moral notion. If we keep putting things in here in such a way that it causes us to abdicate our responsibilities to our family and other human beings, that becomes immoral. But the mere putting in of any one substance, I don't get it. Then I go to the next idea, which is the notion that we should be that inherently that one adult selling one substance to another adult, explain this, that if I, as an adult, sell heroin or cocaine or marijuana or LSD or MDMA, ecstasy, how is that any different from a moral basis than selling you a cigarette or booze? I mean, given that we know that medically, alcohol does more harm and is one of the most dangerous drugs we have on the face of the earth. Any independent group of scientists that look at the relative risks of drugs put alcohol and tobacco right at the top. We know that if you interview heroin addicts and you ask them what's the hardest drug to quit, the vast majority of heroin addicts go, oh, cigarettes. Cigarettes. Hands down. Never been a debate about that. So why is the mere selling? Put the laws, what the laws are aside, just the act itself. On what basis? So I operate with the assumption there's nothing inherently immoral about using or selling any of these things adult to adult, right? In that basic way. The question then becomes, how do we manage this sale, this possession, this use, these lines? And I believe that the objective we should aspire to, if I have to define the objective of my work, my organization in one sentence, albeit a long sentence, it is to reduce the role of criminalization and the criminal justice system in drug control to the maximum extent consistent with protecting public safety and health. Moving down this spectrum, I'm aiming to reduce the role of criminalization, the criminal justice system in drug control to the maximum extent consistent with protecting safety and health. Moving down this way, I'm looking at what the Europeans are doing. And the Europeans are doing things like saying we're not going to put people in jail anymore for drug possession. They're saying we're going to make sure that people can get, whether it's methadone or buprenorphine, and get it in a pharmacy or a clinic, and not just in segregated clinics like we do in the United States with methadone. They're saying if you can't quit by other means, you come to this clinic in Switzerland, Denmark, Germany, Netherlands, Canada, UK, and we will allow you to obtain pharmaceutical heroin if that's the drug that's going to help you stay out of a life of crime and begin to stabilize your life. It's the ones that say we're going to focus on reducing disease and suffering and not focus on coercing you to be abstinent. It's those basic models. Now, there's one area, of course, where the United States is leading the way, and that's on marijuana. Half the states have now legalized marijuana for medical purposes. Right? 80% of Americans believe marijuana should be legal for medicine. Over 50% now believe it should be legally sold, taxed, and regulated like alcohol. 2 states, Washington and Colorado, just legalized it a year and a half ago and are beginning to roll out and set up legal distribution systems. Hopefully Oregon and Alaska will do so in November, the first country outside the U.S. Uruguay just did the same thing. We're moving to take something out of the criminal justice system. What will happen? We'll arrest fewer people. 700,000 people won't get criminal records anymore. Gangsters won't be earning billions of dollars from this, whether in Mexico or in our country. We'll stop violating civil rights and civil liberties of ordinary people. But ask this question, is marijuana use going to go up when we legalize marijuana? I think it will. Be cheaper, more legally available. Is it going to go up among kids? I don't think so. Why not among kids? Who's got the best access to marijuana today in America? Teenagers. Who had the best access 10 years, 20, 30 years ago? Teenagers. 10, 20, 30 years from now, whether legalized or not for adults, teenagers. 3 national surveys in which teenagers say it's easier to buy marijuana than to buy alcohol. Teenagers hear adults saying, well, we got to keep marijuana illegal to protect you youngsters. Youngsters are going like, what the hell have you been smoking? I mean, you got to be kidding me, right? But you know who's going to use more marijuana? I think it's going to be older people. People in their 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s. People finding that they prefer it to the sleeping pill, or they prefer it to the drink at the end of the evening, or maybe it works better for them than that opioid pharmaceutical, enables them to take a little less of that opioid pharmaceutical because the two things work in tandem. Maybe it helps with their diabetes or their arthritis, the aches and pains of growing older, and maybe it even spices up a marriage of 30 or 40 years. Is that going to be a public health nightmare? I don't think so. Is it going to be a net public health benefit apart from all the benefits on the criminal justice and fiscal side? Possibly. Possibly. So, now when I come over to the issue about where my work increasingly overlaps with yours, I'll put it in a few areas. The first one is this. Ultimately, what we know is that the best defense against drug abuse and drug addiction is the educated consumer. The educated consumer, people knowing what it is they're doing, what it is they're taking, finding the ways for people to become educated. Ideally, the consumer's doing that, but also those who are providing and advising them on that, right? We know that that's got to be part of it. Sometimes, just to give a little thought experiment, imagine if you physicians no longer had the power of prescription. That we went back to the old days of the original Food and Drug Act where you had the power of recommendation, but not of prescription. Imagine that anybody could go to a pharmacy and get any drug that they wanted to get. And they would go to see their physician to get recommendations about what they should do as part of the proper medical care. But before the pharmacist could legally hand it over to them, a little screen would pop up with 10 questions that you had to answer before the pharmacist was legally empowered to hand you that medication. And you cannot get it till you answer those 10 questions correctly about interaction, about dose, all this sorts of stuff. You could take the test as many times as you wanted. If you're blind, it could be read to you. It would be in every available language. But you would be forced to learn something, not just pick up an orange bottle with a little thing, do not drive, may make you drowsy, that the doctor gave you. Imagine that thought experiment. When we think about how heavily we're going to rely on the controls, right, of going after the pharmacists and the suppliers, yes, you need to be more responsible. Of course you do. Of course it is incumbent upon you to understand that opiates, we've gone from the period of opiophobia to overutilization of opiates to deal with chronic pain, and now to a kind of anti-opiate McCarthyism where everybody's attacked for doing these sorts of things. But somehow we have to come to a more sensible and compassionate middle ground of combining the science and the art of pain management. It does mean, and I'm so glad that the issue of medical marijuana is on the agenda here later this week, because I remember speaking at pain conferences in past years and asking how many people were utilizing or recommending marijuana, whether obtained in a pharmaceutical form or whether obtained in from the clinic or obtained from the black market, and so few were. And that seemed to me the improper practice of medicine. Oh, some doctors said, how can you tell somebody to go smoke their medicine? Isn't that crazy? Well, wait a second. If smoking their medicine accomplishes pain relief with minimal problems, what difference does it make if they smoke their medicine? Now it's becoming a moot issue with vaporization, but what's the bottom line but taking away the pain and suffering of this? As evidence begins to emerge of the psychedelics, whether it's LSD or mescaline or whether it's MDMA or other things, and studies now being finally funded by the government to look at their role in dealing with the anxiety and pain, anxiety and depression and pain, whether it's of terminally ill, are you going to be open to it? I go and speak to my fellow marijuana gatherings, and they're all anti-opiate. And I say, shut the hell up. Because the bottom line is marijuana is not a panacea and opioids are not a panacea. And marijuana can help some people for some conditions in some ways, and opiates can help some. And yes, opiates have a greater risk factor, but they are much more effective and more powerful for many conditions than cannabis is. And sometimes we see they go together. And then that wonderful study that just came out in JAMA Internal Medicine last week, that in the states that have the most ample medical marijuana programs, overdose fatalities dropped by 25%. They have not proven a causal relationship between the medical marijuana and that, but that's the strong hypothesis going in. And what does that mean? That people are substituting cannabis for opiates, that they are combining them, that something else is going on. I'll also just say, you know, for me and my organization, we get known for changing the marijuana laws and rolling back incarceration, but we are deeply committed in leading the country when it comes to trying to reduce overdose fatalities. By making naloxone more widely available, Vermont just passing a law to allow it over-the-counter sale, I believe. Now a bill that we got through to Jerry Brown's desk in California to allow over-the-counter sale of naloxone. It seems to me that anybody getting a prescription for opiates should be getting that prescription, not prescription, but be getting naloxone and training in how to use it, because that's important not just for heroin addicts, but for people using pharmaceuticals with a doctor's recommendation. I hate the way so many of these things are called overdoses. Most people who die of a quote-unquote overdose are not dying of taking too much of that opiate. They're dying because they were combining those opiates with alcohol or benzos or what have you, and people don't know it. Reading the New York Times, overdose, 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 and maybe in the small print days or weeks later, the report that says it was actually a combination. But is the government putting out that kind of information? Are you all putting out that kind of information? When you recommend opioids, are you making sure that naloxone is part of your patient education and making sure that people have that in the house and that family members know how to use it? Ultimately, what are we trying to do here? We're trying to reduce pain. We're trying to reduce the pain that comes with cancer and broken bones and burns and illnesses. We're trying to reduce the pain that comes with the misuse of drugs and the addiction and suffering that causes. We're trying to reduce pain that comes with the stigma associated with pain and with the treatment of pain. We're trying to reduce the pain that happens when government takes away people's basic freedoms and treats them like slaves in a modern society. It's all about managing and reducing pain in our society. We need to move forward into a more holistic drug policy in which we rely on the crutches of criminalization and prohibition and backward, nonsensical, stupid regulation as little as possible. But the alternative, the obligation on our parts, is to use our hearts and our brains and never become dependent upon, let's just give that guy the drug they want or need. Let's not do it because it's easy when we get out of our office. Let's not do it because we don't know if that guy's scamming us or not. Let's not do it because that's better reimbursed by the government or the insurance companies. Let's not do it for their own reasons, but only focus as the best body workers and the best head workers may study in a particular approach, but ultimately are integrative in the approaches they bring in dealing with the people who come before them, for which people are deeply grateful. So it is in the area of pain management. I hope that I can count on you as allies in the struggle to end the war on drugs. My ability and the ability of our growing movement to end the war on drugs depends in part upon those of you who operate in the world of legal drugs to provide the right models. The arguments that people throw in my face is, Ethan, how can you talk about pulling back on criminalization when we don't obviously know how to deal with illegal drugs properly? But do it, do it, do it. Faster, better, be wise. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ethan. That was great.